She screamed for help as flames engulfed her home. But when a black firefighter rushed in to save her, she refused his touch. Blinded by prejudice in a moment where every second counted, her decision could have cost her life. What happens next will leave you speechless and prove that true courage has no color. Stay with us until the end. This is a story of fire, forgiveness, and the power of humanity. The fire started just after midnight in the quaint village of Saint-Éloi, nestled in the rolling hills of Provence, France. It was a cold March night in 2025, and the wind howled through the narrow cobblestone streets, carrying the scent of lavender and impending doom. The blaze erupted in the old stone house of Madame Élise Dubois, a widow in her late 70s known for her sharp tongue and sharper prejudices. No one knew how it began, perhaps a forgotten candle or a faulty heater, but within minutes the flames devoured the wooden beams and lace curtains, turning the home into an inferno. The villagers gathered at a safe distance, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange glow. Smoke billowed into the starry sky, and the crackle of burning timber drowned out their murmurs. The local fire brigade arrived, a small team of volunteers led by Capitaine Pierre Moreau. Among them was Jamal Carter, a 28-year-old firefighter who had moved to Saint-Éloi 2 years prior. Born in Paris to a Senegalese mother and an American father, Jamal's dark skin and broad shoulders made him stand out in the predominantly white village. He was the newest recruit, quiet but fiercely dedicated, and tonight would test his mettle like never before. "Madame Dubois is still inside!" shouted a neighbor, Madame Claire, clutching her shawl. "I saw her at the window. She wouldn't come down." Pierre barked orders, directing his team to douse the flames licking the exterior walls. Jamal grabbed an oxygen mask and an axe, his heart pounding as he scanned the house. The front door was a wall of fire, but a narrow stone staircase on the side led to a second-story window where faint cries echoed through the smoke. "I'm going in," Jamal yelled, adjusting his helmet. Pierre hesitated, then nodded. "Be quick. The roof won't hold much longer." Jamal sprinted up the stairs, the heat searing his gear as he smashed the window with his axe. Glass shattered inward, and he climbed through, landing in a smoke-filled hallway. The air was thick, acrid, stinging his eyes even through the mask. He called out, "Madame Dubois, where are you?" A weak, raspy voice answered from the end of the hall. "Here. Help." He followed the sound, kicking open a door to find Elise crumpled on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by flames. Her silver hair was matted with soot, her nightgown singed. She clutched a rosary, her blue eyes wide with terror. Jamal knelt beside her, extending a gloved hand. "I'm here to get you out. Come with me." But then her gaze locked onto his face, or rather, his skin, visible beneath the mask, and her expression twisted into something ugly. "No!" she spat, recoiling. "Not you. I won't let you touch me." Jamal froze, the words hitting him like a punch. He'd heard whispers of her disdain for outsiders, her rants about immigrants ruining France. But this? In the middle of a fire? "Madame, there's no time. The house is collapsing. Let me help you." "I'd rather die than be saved by someone like you," she hissed, her voice trembling with venom and fear. She coughed violently, the smoke choking her lungs, yet she swatted at his hand. The ceiling groaned above them, a beam cracking ominously. Jamal's training kicked in. Focus, stay calm, but anger simmered beneath his resolve. He could leave her, let her stubborn hatred consume her along with the flames. No one would blame him. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. "Madame, look at me," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. He pulled off his mask, letting her see his face fully, his dark eyes, his humanity. I'm not leaving you here. You don't get to choose who saves you tonight. Her lips quivered, defiance warring with desperation as the fire roared closer. A chunk of plaster fell, narrowly missing her head. She gasped, clutching her rosary tighter, and for the first time, doubt flickered in her eyes. The heat was unbearable now, pressing against Jamal like a living thing. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mixing with the soot staining his face. The bedroom was a furnace. Flames danced along the walls, consuming faded wallpaper and an old wooden dresser. Élise Dubois remained hunched on the floor, her frail body trembling as she glared at him through the haze. Her words still echoed in his mind. I'd rather die than be saved by someone like you. But the crack of another beam splitting overhead snapped him back to the moment. There was no time for her hate, no time for anything but action. Madame, we're going, Jamal said, his tone firm but not harsh. He reached for her again, ignoring the way she flinched. This time he didn't wait for permission. He scooped her up in his arms, her weight surprisingly light despite her rigid resistance. She thrashed weakly, her fists pounding against his chest, but her strength was fading fast, sapped by the smoke and her own stubbornness. "Let me go," she croaked, her voice hoarse. "I don't want your hands on me." "You don't have a choice," he shot back, adjusting his grip as he turned toward the hallway. The fire had spread, blocking the path he'd taken. Flames licked at the doorframe, and the window he'd entered through was now a glowing maw of heat. He cursed under his breath, scanning for an escape. The staircase beyond the bedroom door was still intact. Barely. It was their only shot. Élise coughed violently, her body slumping against him as the smoke took its toll. Her rosary slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. And for a moment, Jamal thought she'd passed out. But her eyes fluttered open, and she muttered something he couldn't catch. Something bitter, laced with fear. "Hold on," he said, more to himself than to her. He kicked the bedroom door wider and plunged into the hallway, the heat singeing his gear. The staircase loomed ahead, its stone steps blackened but still standing. Smoke swirled around them, thick and suffocating, and he could feel his own lungs straining despite his training. Elise's protests had weakened to whimpers, her hands clutching his jacket now instead of pushing him away. Halfway down the stairs, the roof gave a deafening groan. Jamal glanced up just as a cascade of burning timber crashed down, missing them by inches. The impact shook the house, sending a shockwave of dust and embers through the air. He stumbled, nearly dropping her, but tightened his hold and kept moving. His heart hammered in his chest, part adrenaline, part fury. She didn't deserve this effort. Not after what she'd said, but he couldn't stop. Not now. They burst out of the side entrance into the frigid night air, the contrast jarring. The crowd gasped as Jamal emerged, Élise cradled in his arms like a reluctant child. He set her down on the grass a safe distance from the house, his breaths coming in sharp bursts. The fire brigade rushed forward, Pierre with an oxygen mask, Claire with a blanket, but Jamal barely registered them. His eyes were locked on Élise, who lay coughing and shivering, her face smeared with ash. "You're safe," he said, his voice low, almost a challenge. "You're welcome." She didn't respond, not at first. Her gaze darted to the burning house, then back to him, her expression unreadable. The flames reflected in her watery eyes, and for a fleeting second, Jamal thought he saw something shift, something softer, vulnerable. But then her lips pressed into a thin line, and she turned her head away, clutching the blanket Claire draped over her shoulders. Pierre clapped Jamal on the back. "Good work, Carter. You're a damn hero." Jamal nodded. But the word felt hollow. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Gratitude, maybe, or at least a crack in her armor. Instead, Elise's silence stung more than her earlier words. He stepped back, letting the medics take over, and watched as the house collapsed in on itself, a roaring skeleton of what it once was. The fire was out by dawn, leaving behind a smoldering ruin where Élise Dubois's house once stood. The village of Saint-Éloi buzzed with subdued chatter as the sun rose over the Provençal hills, casting a pale light on the charred remains. The air still carried the sharp tang of smoke, mingling with the faint sweetness of lavender fields nearby. Jamal stood near the fire truck, his gear streaked with soot, watching as the medics tended to Élise on a stretcher a few yards away. She was alive, shaken, coughing, but alive. He should have felt relief, pride even, but instead, a knot of frustration tightened in his chest. Pierre approached, handing him a bottle of water. "You did what most wouldn't, Jamal. She's a tough old bird, but you got her out." Jamal took the bottle, twisting off the cap with more force than necessary. "She didn't want me to." "You heard her." Pierre sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's been like that forever. Cranky, set in her ways. Don't take it personal." But it was personal. Jamal had felt the weight of her words, the venom in her rejection. He'd grown up with stares and whispers. Paris wasn't always kind to a kid with his skin, but this was different. This was life or death, and she'd still seen him as less than human. He downed half the water, trying to wash away the bitterness. Across the grass, Élise sat upright now, an oxygen mask pressed to her face. Her silver hair hung in tangled strands, and her hands trembled as she gripped the blanket around her shoulders. The medics had cleared her. No serious injuries, just smoke inhalation and shock. She'd refused to go to the hospital, insisting she'd rather stay in Saint-Éloi, even with nowhere left to call home. Claire hovered nearby, fussing over her, but Elise's eyes kept drifting, not to the ruins of her house, but to Jamal. He noticed it after a while, the way her gaze lingered, then darted away when he met it. It wasn't gratitude, not yet, but it wasn't the same venom either. Curiosity, maybe. Guilt? He couldn't tell, and he wasn't sure he cared. He turned to help the crew pack up, rolling hoses and stowing gear, when Claire's voice cut through the morning stillness. "Jamal, could you come here a moment?" He hesitated, then walked over, his boots crunching on the damp grass. Élise stiffened as he approached, her fingers tightening on the blanket. Claire smiled nervously, gesturing between them. "Madame Dubois wanted to... well, she has something to say." Jamal crossed his arms, waiting. Élise removed the oxygen mask with shaky hands, her breath ragged but steadying. She looked up at him, her blue eyes clouded with age and something else. Conflict, perhaps. For a long moment, she said nothing, the silence stretching taut between them. "I didn't want you to save me," she began, her voice low and cracked. "I meant what I said in there." Jamal's jaw clenched, but he held her gaze. "I know." Her lips pursed, as if the admission cost her something. "My whole life I've seen people like you come here, taking jobs, changing things. I thought you didn't belong, that you'd ruin what we had." She paused, coughing into her fist. "But last night, when the fire was everywhere, I saw my husband's face. He died 10 years ago, in a car accident. He was a good man, but he hated foreigners too. We both did. It's how we were raised." Jamal shifted his weight, unsure where this was going. He didn't need her life story, didn't want her excuses. But she kept talking, her words spilling out like they'd been trapped too long. I prayed to him, to God, to anyone, to get me out. And then you came. You, of all people. Her voice broke and she looked down at her hands. I don't understand it. I don't know why it was you. It doesn't matter why, Jamal said, his tone clipped. I wasn't there for your approval. I was there because it's my job. She flinched at that, and Claire stepped closer, touching her shoulder. Elise, he saved your life. Doesn't that mean something? Elise didn't answer right away. She stared at the ground, her rosary gone but her fingers moving as if it were still there. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. It means I was wrong. Not about everything, but about you. Jamal blinked, caught off guard. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was more than he'd expected. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck. What could he say? That it was enough? It wasn't. That it changed nothing? It didn't, not yet. Before he could decide, Elise looked up again, her eyes searching his. What's your name? Jamal Carter, he said, almost reluctantly. She nodded, as if committing it to memory. Jamal Carter, she repeated softly. I won't forget it. The morning stretched on in Saint-Éloi, the sky shifting from pale gray to a soft, golden hue. The fire crew had packed up, leaving only a few villagers milling about, their voices hushed as they surveyed the wreckage of Élise Dubois's home. Jamal lingered near the truck, his hands shoved in his pockets, the weight of the night settling into his bones. Elise's words, I was wrong, about you, hung in the air, fragile and unfinished. He didn't know what to make of them, didn't trust them fully, but they'd stirred something in him all the same. Claire had taken Elise to her own house down the street, offering a spare room until something could be sorted out. Before they left, Elise had glanced back at Jamal one last time, her expression unreadable but softer than before. No handshake, no grand gesture, just a look, and then she was gone, leaning on Claire's arm as they disappeared around the corner. Jamal watched them go, his chest tight with a mix of exhaustion and unease. Pierre clapped him on the shoulder again, breaking his reverie. Go home, Carter. Get some rest. You've earned it. Jamal nodded, but sleep felt far off. He drove his beat-up Renault back to his small apartment on the edge of the village, the road winding past fields still damp with dew. Inside, he shed his gear, the smell of smoke clinging to everything, and collapsed onto the couch. His phone buzzed, a text from his mother in Paris, asking how he was holding up in that little nowhere town. He smiled faintly, typing a quick reply. Fine. Long night. Tell you later. But as he lay there, staring at the ceiling, Elise's face kept creeping into his thoughts. Not the venomous glare from the fire, but the quieter one after, the one that seemed to wrestle with itself. He wondered what she'd do with that moment, whether it'd fade like the embers of her house or take root, forcing her to reckon with decades of hate. He wanted to believe it could change her, but he'd seen too many people cling to their biases like lifelines. Maybe she'd just bury it, tell herself it didn't mean anything. Maybe she'd never speak his name again. A week later, Jamal was back on duty, hosing down the truck after a routine call, when Claire appeared at the station. She carried a small paper bag, her smile tentative. For you, she said, handing it over. From Elise. He opened it, puzzled, and pulled out a loaf of fresh-baked bread. Pain de campagne, crusty and warm, the kind his grandmother used to make. Tucked inside was a note in shaky handwriting. Jamal Carter, thank you. I'm still learning. Élise. He stared at it, the words simple but heavy. Claire shifted on her feet. She's been quiet since the fire. Keeps to herself mostly. But she asked me about you, where you're from, how you ended up here. I think she's trying. Jamal folded the note, slipping it into his pocket. Trying's a start, he said, his voice neutral. He didn't say more, didn't need to. Claire nodded, understanding, and left him to his work. That night, he ate the bread with a bowl of soup, the taste grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't forgiveness, he wasn't there yet, and maybe he never would be. But it was something, a crack in the wall, a step forward. He thought about his own life, how he'd fought to belong in places that didn't always want him, how he'd built a quiet strength out of it. Élise had her own fight now, one he couldn't wage for her. Whether she'd win it, he didn't know. In Saint-Éloi, life moved on. The ruins of Élise's house were cleared, leaving an empty lot where wildflowers would eventually bloom. Jamal kept doing his job, saving who he could, black skin and all. And Élise, somewhere in Claire's spare room, kept wrestling with her past, her prayers shifting to include a name she'd once refused to say. The village watched, whispered, waited. Change was slow, messy, uncertain, but it was there, flickering like a spark in the dark, waiting for someone to fan it into flame.